Hi class, today we're going to talk about the miter saw. This is what we call a sliding compound miter saw. And that means, as you can see, the head slides while cutting, the base turns, which we call a mitered cut. And I'm not going to loosen it, but we can also loosen the head back here, tilt it side to side, and that would be referred to as a beveled cut. The miter saw is designed to cross-cut wood. And if you remember from earlier, cross-cutting is cutting against the grain, which is reducing the board in length. We're not cutting with the grain, that's ripping. Cross-cutting is against the grain. So we're always going to be reducing a board in length. If we need to rip a piece of wood, we could use the table saw or the band saw. When you come up to use the saw, you should always hold the board with your left hand and put your right hand on the handle or the trigger and operate the saw up and down with your right hand. We never ever want to cross our arms while operating. If we held with the left hand and our right hand holds the board, your arm will get dangerously close to the blade guard and the blade itself. If you are a left-handed operator, you could put the board on the right side, hold your right hand, and operate with your left arm. But the motor right here will block your vision, and it's not very easy to see the blade from that angle. It's easier to learn to operate the saw by holding with your left hand and holding the handle with your right. Whenever we're cutting, we want to observe a margin of safety of 4 inches. 4 inches is marked out on either side of the blade if you're ever curious as where that would be. This means we can never cut a board that is less than 4 inches in length. We always have to cut a board that's longer. If we had a board that was 6 inches in length and we were trying to cut off a 3-inch piece, it still wouldn't work because we'd have to get within 3 inches to cut that 3-inch piece out of a 6-inch board. So sometimes you'll need a board that's even longer than 4 inches, but 4 inches, never cut anything shorter than that. If we're making cuts and we want them to be repeated and accurate, we can use these down here, which are stop blocks. They flip down, we can slide the board over them, we set them ahead of time to the length we want, and then we don't need to measure. We can just come forward and make our cut. If we're going to make a cut based off of a mark that we've already made, let's say there's a mark right there on my board, we need to remember about the kerf. The kerf is the thickness of the saw blade. If we bring the blade down and we remove the blade cover, we can see the blade is roughly about 1/8 of an inch thick. If we wanted to keep this piece of wood, we would need to line up our blade with the left edge on the right side of the blade, or the mark on the left edge of our blade. This would mean that our piece would be accurate. If you put the right side of the blade on your mark, your piece would be 1/8 inch short. So you always want to make sure you know what the kerf is and how it relates to your cut before you start cutting. If you're making a cut on a small piece of wood, it's relatively simple. You can come on up, you don't need to worry about sliding. You have to press this button right here before you pull the handle on the trigger. And whenever we're cutting, we want to minimize the amount of time we spend between the top position and the bottom position. We can see here that this blade guard will slowly start to come back as we push the blade down. That's when the blade's exposed in the most dangerous spot. So in this case, I'd hold my left hand, make a cut, and after it stops, bring the saw back up. If we have a larger board like this one that we want to cut, we'll need to slide. Whenever we're doing a sliding cut, we need to bring the saw out first. We'll line up our cut where we'd want to make it, bring the saw where we need it to be, all the way out. We would turn the saw on, we'll go down, push in while we're making the cut, we'll let go of the handle, and bring it up quickly as the blade comes to a stop. Let me demonstrate that now. One more thing to note with our pieces, if you ever have a piece that you're cutting, there's a bit of a gap between the table of the miter saw and our outfeed table area. If you go over here and try to push, it'll lift the piece up. Be careful that you're placing your hand on the table, but not within the 4 inches that is our margin of safety. If we ever have a board that's extremely warped, like this one is right here, where there's a big bow in the board, sort of like a banana shape, we want to make sure that the valley the valley faces upward. So we want the high ends of our board to be on either end, not in the middle. If the high point is in the middle like this, when we cut, the board will fall in on the blade, it'll pinch the blade, and it'll cause kickback. Unlike the table saw, the board doesn't go flying when you get kickback on the miter saw, but the head itself pushes back at you and jerks violently. We want to avoid this, and if you ever have a board that's this bad, like this one is right here, you probably shouldn't be using the miter saw to cut the first cut. You should try to get into smaller, more manageable pieces first.